Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. And I'm very excited that today my guest is Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, a professor and director of the Asia Nonproliferation Project at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, and really one of the world's best experts on nuclear nonproliferation issues. He's arms control wonk on social, and that's also the name of his podcast. And he has actually two podcasts, and the other podcast, the new one, is The Reason We're Still Here. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So the reason I wanted to have you on is that there's a lot that's going on in the nuclear nonproliferation space, obviously with the Russian war in Ukraine. There's a lot of things happening in North Korea that you're tracking very closely with missile launches. Obviously, Iran continues to advance on the nuclear program. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is actually what's happening here in the United States. We're in the midst of a revamp of our nuclear deterrent. You've been pretty vocal on some of those issues. We have the new ICBM program called Sentinel that I don't think you're a big fan of. So tell us why and what you think overall of our efforts to rebuild our nuclear arsenal.
Well, I tend to think that deterrence is a pretty important part of our national security structure. So I'm not one to talk about disarmament a lot. At the same time, nuclear weapons are expensive, and the U.S. has a pretty substantial arsenal, and there's on the books a plan to essentially recapitalize that force on an almost one-to-one basis. And I think my frustration throughout this process, and this has now been going on for 15 years, is the cost estimates have not been realistic and costs keep growing. And there's almost, I would argue, a refusal to make hard choices about what we have money for and what we don't. I just don't see a lot of extra value in an ICBM force. And kind of frustratingly, there are like a lot of cheaper ways to achieve the same thing that keep getting pushed aside. So like my pet kind of peeve is the missiles that we put on submarines, those would work fine in silos. There isn't really a technical reason that you couldn't double up, and we're going to eventually have to replace those anyway. But, it's like we kind of refuse to do it for like the same reason that like the Air Force and the Navy and the Army have like different camouflage patterns, right? Like everybody wants their own thing. And I just like don't think we can afford to do that. So yeah, Sentinel,
but hold on a second. So traditionally, since the early days of the nuclear age, one of the things that everyone's talked about is that you needed a triad of nuclear weapons, that you need land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, you need a submarine-based launch force, and you needed bombers as well. And that would give you credible deterrent that if one of those forces was in danger or was somehow struck first, like the land-based missiles, for example, you always had a redundancy there. So why do you think that's no longer relevant?
One thing I would say is that the justification of a triad came after we had the forces. So there wasn't a moment, for example, where somebody sat down and said, if I was going to design a force, I would design it with 3 legs. I would do it like this. We acquired these forces piecemeal and then kind of back justified them.
Although everyone else is trying to copy that too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, once you do something, right, like you set the standard. It used to be the case that land-based ICBMs could do things that other forces couldn't. So there was a specific rationale. So, for example, the accuracy of land-based missiles was initially considerably greater than missiles aboard submarines. It was also the case that communications with submarines were considered a little iffy. Early on, the range of the missiles on submarines was not as great. And so what we've seen, I would say, over the last 30 years is that submarine-based missiles have become more accurate, communications have become more assured, the range is essentially unlimited. And so they've kind of eaten into the value space previously occupied by land-based missiles. So I think the historical arguments were actually quite good in the moment. I just don't tend to think that they're true now. And so when you ask people to justify the ICBM force today, they make different kinds of arguments that I just find less compelling. So like one is, if you have 400 ICBMs, these are 400 aim points in the United States. And so an attacker would have to strike the United States as opposed to just attacking the submarines at sea or the bombers in the air. Now, I just don't find that persuasive because, some of the submarines are in port and the bombers are not in the air, right? The bombers are on the ground. And so I I feel like as those rationales have evolved, at least to me, they have become less compelling at the price point of Sentinel. That to me is very important. It's at the price point. I wouldn't just get rid of the ones we have now, but you're asking to like rebuy it.
What about the idea that we need it for insurance, that today the submarine force is very good. These nuclear submarines are very quiet, hard to trace, but developments in sonar, other sensing technology could one day neutralize it, and it takes a long time to build these ICBMs, rebuild those silos. So if we don't have it now, it may be too late at some point in the future.
Well, I think that the insurance argument is a good one, and it's a good one to explore because we have all sorts of discussions in non-nuclear areas about like how much you want to insure, right? I think my favorite example of this is car insurance. Like, do you really want to insure the full value of your car because you end up overpaying, right? And in a world of scarce defense resources, if you're over-insuring the nuclear force, then that's capability you don't have in other places. So I'm a little skeptical of the way we approach insuring. At the same time, like, yes, there is some reasonable risk. So I do think that it would make sense to give ourselves the option of deploying sea-based missiles on the land. I think it makes sense to retain some of the infrastructure that we might use. Like I wouldn't blow up the silos. Even if the silos were sitting empty, I would retain them. I would probably spend money to keep them. We should probably have, we should definitely have an incredibly robust research effort precisely on the kinds of technologies that would lead to the submarine force being vulnerable. Because if that happens, that is a significant sea change, and we would want to anticipate it. And if it's going to happen, we'd like to be first. So like that's where I would rather spend that money.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the specifics. So we have the Trident missile, nuclear tip missile, that is used in our Ohio-class submarines and also used by the Brits on their submarines. And you're saying instead of developing a completely new missile to replace the Minuteman, that's the current land-based ICBM, the Sentinel program that we have the DoD working on, you'd use the Trident. Talk a little bit about how that would work.
Yeah, the downside of that is, you have some risk that if a single problem emerges with the entire Trident missile force, then you do run that risk, right? And that's true. But most countries really only have a small number of missiles, and in fact, there's usually a lot of commonality among them. So it's actually a pretty small trade space where, given how similar the production origins of those systems are, it would be pretty unusual to have a problem develop in one and not the other. But like, whatever. The reality is that Trident, the D5, is a very long-range missile. Sometimes people say it doesn't have the range to reach the targets in Russia, but that's because the reported range is with 8 warheads, which is not what we would load it out with. When you download to say 4 or 5 warheads, which is what they go out with at sea, the range is actually quite sufficient, especially if you were to go below that. It has a lot of advantages in that it's a proven system, right? It's got an excellent test record. It is extremely accurate.
And originally, the original version we fielded in like late 70s, right? So it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, and we are ultimately going to replace this, right? So, if to my mind, Trident replacement is going to be an absolutely crucial and important program, and that is at least where I would want to make sure that we have adequate resources, industrial base in order to do that. Because that system will ultimately need replacing. And when that comes up, that's truly going to be a capability I don't think we can afford to live with.
Right. And the alternative, the Sentinel, it keeps getting increased in cost as those programs tend to do, right? And I think the number right now is somewhere around 130 billion, which is not pocket change, right? It's substantial over a number of years, though. But
we experienced this with MX. I actually, at the beginning of this in the Obama administration, I went back because people were claiming we'd get Sentinel for like under $100 billion. And I was like, just inflation adjust the cost of MX, and it's going to be a lot.
Yeah. And part of that cost is the missile itself, obviously a huge part of it, but there needs to be a refurbishment of the existing silos. They're very, very old, right? They're built in the 60s, and using old technology, although I have to say that as someone who's done cyber for 2 decades of my life, I'm very nervous about moving off sort of old 60s era computing that's not connected to anything to modern, presumably Windows based or something of that sort, operating systems that we know have issues, right? And they're much more complicated in nature. So I actually worry a lot more about nuclear command and control safety issues with the cyber risk.
Me too.
Given this modernization. But you would agree that at least portion of that money, even if you don't build a new missile, we have to spend on these new silos, right?
Yeah. I mean, the missile itself is just the kind of the most interesting part of a broader weapon system that's embedded in infrastructure. And my sense is we almost always chronically underinvest in infrastructure, and in particular in command and control, which, one of the reasons I'm such a skeptic of so many of these programs is we will spend hundreds of billions of dollars on these systems, and when it comes time to design the command and control system, there will be no money left over, and people are like, well, don't worry about it. And it's like, no, I would much rather have a worse missile and a robust command and control system than the other way around. But you could just never get the Air Force to want to do that. And so it makes me a little bit skeptical. But yeah, absolutely. I think one really powerful argument against buying Sentinel now is precisely that we're in this moment of rapid technological change. And I'm not sure if it happens that we decide we do need land-based missiles. I'm not sure what the rationale will be, and I'm not sure what the right modality will be. It may be that we end up deciding that we don't want land-based missiles at all, but we want a much bigger submarine force, but we might decide we want land-based missiles, but that they have to be mobile, right? And then all the money we sink into silos.
So that's an interesting point, right? Because our adversaries, Russia and North Korea in particular, are prioritizing a mobile launching force, right? Why haven't we done that?
It was unpopular. Again, you study this stuff long enough, right? You get really cynical. The reality is that in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the requirements to support mobile missiles, basing them in the Western United States, were extremely unpopular with local ranchers in terms of just the land that would be consumed, the water that would be used, the disruption, and these were not peace-loving hippies, right? These were like the Clive Van Bundys of the era. And
these are the NIMBYs, though, not in my backyard, right?
Yes, that's right. But very conservative NIMBYs. And so when the Reagan administration inherited from the Carter administration this plan to do this massive deployment of mobile missiles, it didn't matter how conservative or how hawkish, rather, Reagan was. He was a good politician, right? He was not going to serially alienate his base. And so the Reagan administration went through a series of studies where when you did it analytically, you were like, the best thing to do is to make these things mobile. And then that answer would come back, and the Reagan people would be like, no, the best thing to do is get reelected, so do the study again. And that's ultimately why we ended up putting the MX, a system that was supposed to be mobile, into silos.
And when we started looking at the revitalization effort under Obama, no one bothered to look at the mobile issue again, because you'd expect a Democratic president would care a lot less about these conservative states that he would not win anyway.
Yeah, I think that the politics of this are such that the services just wanted to run everything back. Right? The Air Force wanted new missiles to go in the same silos, and they wanted bombers to replace the bombers we had. Similarly, the Navy just wanted replacement submarines. It isn't the case, I think, that there's really anybody who sits in the bureaucracy and designs a system from the ground up. I mean, I remember I had an argument in the Obama administration with a person who is sort of more enthusiastic about bigger nuclear forces than I am. And we were talking about whether to retire a certain system. And we both agreed it was useless. But My argument was it's useless and I don't want to spend the money on maintaining it and the training time for the forces to be able to use it. And he said something interesting. He said, if we retire it, we'll never get it back. Politically, once it's gone, it will be impossible to resurrect. And I might want it someday. And I think that was a really great, insight. I don't think it's a disreputable opinion he had. You're never building the force from the ground up, right? You're modifying what you have, and there's sort of this enormous lock-in that happens. And so I am just really reluctant to spend $130 billion, and it's going to be more than that, right, on building a force that I think is inferior to the alternatives and which may be very vulnerable to technological change. So it's a lot of money to spend right now on a thing I don't necessarily know I need when, there is stuff we need. We are about to run an arms race with the Russians and the Chinese. So we are going to have to invest in capability.
And, you are the missile expert, but do we actually need to replace the Minuteman? I mean, is there some refurbishments we can do? Do we need to build a new missile from scratch? It's served us well for so many decades. Can it go for another 4 decades?
I mean, I think you would want to rebuild the solid motors, right? Because the solid motors age, and there have been, the solid motors that are deployed have been rebuilt. So it's hard to know because there are these technical arguments that say, well, we can't really rebuild them anymore.
But because the factories are shut down, or?
Well, no. I mean, this is a funny thing. Know that, D5 production line was open until recently. I think finally it is shut down now. But no, because the space launch systems the U.S. makes, solid propellant missiles, they're basically they really have the same design heritage. So, I think the reality is often, in my experience, the reason that people say you can't life extend things or do partial replacements is because they want to do the bigger, better thing. And it becomes very hard to argue with the company when it says, look, I know you can't do that. And that's I actually think we can probably, but you just don't want to. But you are the technical experts. And so if you refuse to admit it can be done, you do kind of have me stuck. Right. But,
and I can imagine you could run a competitive bidding process of, let's look at the 2 options. That's what you would do in the private sector, right? Here's a new missile. Here's refurbishing the existing one. And let's look at what's faster and cheaper. And so forth.
One thing that's been really frustrating about this process is the extent to which the arguments seem to move and change. So the first time I raised this with the Obama administration, I got back a serious answer the D5 won't fit in existing silos. And I was like, yes, it will. I know this because we put the Minuteman the MX, the Peacekeeper, in the existing silos. It's big and they do fit. And then it was well, it doesn't have the range. And so then, you calculate the range and you're calculating with warheads. It's actually going to be less than that, then it does have the range. And then the last argument I heard before I finally got really tired of this was, it's heavier. And so we would have to regrade and repair the roads around the silo field.
I think we know how to do that.
The farmers of North Dakota and Wyoming are going to be fine with new roads. I think, I think the real answer is they don't want to do it. And again, if we lived in a world of infinite resources, I get it. We don't. And it's really hard for me to think that we are in a position at this moment to know what we're going to need. I will give you a perfect example of this. If we were to use the land-based ICBMs from the United States against China, they have to overfly Russia. I do not want to do that. That seems like not a great idea. And DOD sort of assures us
is that because you have to take the northern path? Can you fly over the southern pole?
It's too far over the south. I don't know. That seems like not a great idea to me. And so if we're really trying to imagine, what kind of deterrent are we going to need against China's forces? We, don't know what China's forces are going to look like because they're in a period of really rapid change. And it's, really not clear to me that North Pole trajectories are the best way to go. And so does that mean, maybe we need more submarines? Maybe we need the intermediate range missiles? Like, I just, I don't know. And part of the reason I don't know is because China's force isn't really in being. So again, it's asking for a huge sum of money to guard against a future where I'm just very unclear what we're going to need.
Well, let's talk about the intermediate range ballistic missiles because the Trump administration pulled out of the treaty in large part because of the concerns around China. Obviously, there was questions about whether Russia was cheating on this as well. But, right now we're trying to build up that conventional arsenal. Do you think we should be considering nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles again?
You mean intermediate range ballistic missiles?
Intermediate range ballistic missiles.
I think yes. I mean, I'm not sure, like Sentinel, I am not sure that's the answer I would land on. But there are these kind of really interesting questions about what kind of extended deterrence we're going to be trying to do and what plausible strategies for the conventional defense of our allies looks like and how nuclear weapons factor into that. So...
because we don't just worry about Russia and even China anymore, right? North Korea's arsenal is growing significantly. Who knows what's going to happen with Iran? So you need a range of options.
Yes. And I really do take a position like I feel like it is just much too uncertain. I know that we are going to want conventionally armed intermediate range missiles. Our allies are building those in pretty large numbers right now. I think that horse is out of the barn. I would like to have avoided this outcome. But I actually was at a meeting in Berlin, and it was a meeting on missile proliferation. And I was like, here I am, the arms control guy. And I'm like, actually, I think missile proliferation now is good, right? And it was bad when like North Korea and China and everybody else was doing it. But,
now that it's our allies, we should encourage that, right?
What's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Would I like to ban all ballistic missiles on the Korean Peninsula? Yes. But in a situation where North Korea has them, South Korea needs to have them too. That then raises questions about, well, what do you want to use those missiles for? How many of them do you need? And how would that interact with a nuclear capability, right? So you could argue it might be very inexpensive to have a dual capability, but you also run into some signaling concerns, right? Or the possibility of something being misinterpreted. And so I think if you can't answer those questions, then it becomes really hard to know. So Guam is a great example where every time we talk about putting intermediate range missiles in the Pacific, people are like, put them on Guam. And it's like, okay, Guam's in a nice spot, but it's like not very big, right?
Small, yeah. And vulnerable.
So, yes. So, again, I tend to want to put things to sea. I mean, that just tends to be where I end up. And then, one can like kind of sort things out. But, there may be things that land-based ballistic missiles can do.
Yeah. I think we do have to worry about the advancements in sensing in the ocean. And, I think we're coming to an end, most likely, of the diesel submarines because of the improvements in satellite tracking, right? And with diesels, you have to come up for air very frequently. But even if you're underwater for long periods of time, you could see how that force, in 10, 15 years could be much more vulnerable than it is today.
Well, I mean, AI is going to have a really important effect on processing the data, right? And I think at this point, we don't know how efficient it's going to be. So, yeah. But I mean, the example I always think of is, I don't know if you saw the Beatles documentary where you have these like really muddy tapes, and now using AI, you're able to very clearly pull out, oh, here's Paul McCartney's bass, right? Here's just Ringo's drums, and the computer's capable of doing that. Like, well, if you can pull out like, here's the sound of the U.S. submarine, that's a risk.
Could change everything. So let me ask you about our adversaries for a moment. So China, let's talk about it, right? They're going from 300 to at least 1,000 weapons and could be even more. There's some people that think that they actually want to match us in numbers and then, open up a conversation about arms control. Where do you see things going? And there's been, some interesting stories lately about the corruption in the missile force and some of the firings. I think the Russians look at corruption in China and say, yeah, that's cute. So people that sort of overinvest in worrying in thinking that China is so corrupt that it can't do things should actually look at what's happening with Ukraine, with Russia, and the fact that a very corrupt force can still deliver a significant punch and worry about Chinese capabilities, right?
Yeah. I mean, I tend to think domestic politics is the tail that's wagging the dog. So when I look at the history of U.S. defense procurement, or I look at the decisions the Soviet Union made, or I actually look at the history of China's decisions, they're really embedded in specific political contexts of the moment. And so I don't, I'm not somebody who thinks that the Chinese sit there and think like, oh, here's the right number. I think the rocket force thinks I would like more. And whatever that number is, when you get it, the rocket force would be like, I would like even more. And so I think we don't know where that process is going to end.
Do you think part of it is looking at the United States saying we want to be an equal, United States has X, we should have X?
Yeah. Well, yes. And I think that's it's an important thing to keep in mind about political leaders, which is they're not like you or I. They're not people who care deeply about strategic studies. Political leaders believe really simple things like it's better to be strong than weak. More is better than fewer. I shouldn't have less than my opponent. So
it's the slogans, right? Campaign slogans.
Yes. But I think that's how politicians think. I just don't think there's more depth there, or if there is, it's pretty rare. And so the rocket force in China is going to be saying things like, well, we want more. And they're going to have a variety of arguments available to them. And those arguments are going to be things like, why should we have less? It's better to be strong. I think that resonates with this particular leadership. But they're also going to have a budget, right? And I think things like corruption are real. And corruption is real in terms of driving force structure. Like we just see a very high-profile firing of the entire senior leadership of the rocket force for corruption. Like, my guess is 50 years from now, we'll discover that the story of the silos and the expansion is partly a story about strategic choices, but it is also going to partly be a story about some people who got real rich.
Absolutely. As with everything in China.
I don't know.
But how much do you actually worry about this? Because I kind of have the view of 300 warheads is a big enough problem that going to 1,000 or 2,000 does not really change anything for us. And by the way, if they're going to spend tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on that, they're probably not going to have enough to spend it on an amphibious invasion fleet and other things. And that's a good thing for us.
Oh, I am fundamentally a minimum deterrence person. And the reason I'm a minimum deterrence person is because I believe deterrence by punishment works. I'm not, I don't think leaders sit down and carefully calculate, well, at the end of the nuclear war, this is where we'll be, this is where they'll be. Like, I think there is real terror in the destruction that nuclear weapons would wreak and the havoc they would wreak. And that's pretty insensitive to numbers. I just think Vladimir Putin is totally insensitive to whether you drop 10, 100, or 1,000 nuclear weapons on Russia. Like, those are all, I think, to him, impossibly horrible futures to imagine. And I think that's
and for us too, right? Whether it's one or 100. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's why I tend to think that when you see buildups, they're not deeply strategic. They're motivated by this other kind of logic. And to the extent that it's suboptimal, like, yeah, it's great. Because, I remember I had an argument with a commander of U.S. Strategic Command where I was talking about how important it would be to be able to defend the Baltics from Russian aggression purely conventionally. And he was like, well, do you know how expensive that would be? And I was like, yes, but that is worth doing. I want to, give me my $130 billion for Sentinel and, let me arm Estonia to the teeth. Because I think that's a fight we could prevail in. And that would be worth doing. And honestly, a small nuclear arsenal married with a very capable conventional force, I think would probably maximize deterrent much more than a larger arsenal where you're experiencing diminishing returns and you're doing so by starving your conventional forces.
It's a good point, because the ultimate dilemma with the nuclear deterrent is that you're spending a lot of money on something that you hope you will never actually use, right? And the more you can build dual use capabilities that you can use conventionally, that helps you with real problems that you may solve. Not that nuclear threat is not a real problem, but hopefully one that you can deter.
Nuclear weapons have not been used very often, right? And so the number of people killed in nuclear wars is, relatively small compared to the number of people killed in, war wars. I do believe in deterrence. I just think that you don't want to overpay for deterrence that you are basically going to get at 300 warheads. If 1,000 or 3,000 or 30,000 warheads doesn't materially change your deterrent benefit, you don't want to buy that.
All right, so let's talk about North Korea. You and your team spent a lot of time tracking North Korean missile launches, the preparations, as well as the nuclear tests and nuclear test sites. What is going on with North Korea right now? There's a lot of concern. There's a piece that was written by researchers saying that North Korea is preparing to go to war soon because Kim Jong-un is talking about how the South and the North are different countries and will never be unified. And he's taken down the unification ministry and famously taken down the statue of unification that they have.
It's an arch.
An arch, yeah, in North Korea. So what is going on there with the missiles, and what's your view on the overall strategic situation?
The two authors are Sig Hecker and Bob Carlin, who are my colleagues at the Middlebury Institute. I disagree with them. I actually think that Kim Jong-un's rejection of unification is, in a very strange way, a good thing, because he was very explicit in rejecting unification. He also rejected the use of force to unify the peninsula. Now, I want to be clear, he was not like super cuddly about this, right? He said that North Korea would not initiate a war, would not use force, but made it clear that if the U.S. used force, they were going to nuke the living crap out of South Korea, Japan, and the United States. So it was definitely not warm and fuzzy. But I think if you look at the situation, where North Korea is at the moment, is that regime has been really struggling. And the Kim family wants to hold on to power. Kim wants to eventually pass power down to his kids. And the unification stuff, I think, for them is a distraction, right? They want to build an argument for a North Korea that lives under the Kims forever. And so weirdly, I won't rule out North Korean provocations, because they do those for internal political reasons, and we never have any, at least I never see any warning when they're coming.
But Kim Jong-un has actually been much more cautious than his dad, right? I mean, his dad shelled islands, he sunk a frigate. He hasn't done any of that. I mean, there's been tests, but he hasn't killed any South Koreans.
Well, and a lot of people think that that 2010 was so dangerous precisely because there were internal domestic politics that were driving them. And I presume Kim's decision to renounce reunification reflects some kind of political situation he's managing. But yes, he's been much more cautious. It's funny because he's not a cautious person. When he perceived a Chinese threat in the form of his uncle and half-brother, he had them murdered. Like, he's not a,
but that's what you do in the family, right? That's like Thanksgiving.
Well, but I'm just saying, he's not weak, or he's not timid. But at the same time,
but killing his uncle does not endanger his rule. Going to war with South Korea and presumably America.
I think he's very calculated. Yes, I actually think he's probably quite clever and pretty calculating, and has been, in terms of the use of violence, restrained. And I do think, he went out of his way both to meet with Trump. I mean, he genuinely wanted some kind of deliverable.
Three times.
Yep. And when he renounced reunification as a goal, again went out of his way to say, we will not initiate a war. So he has a strategy. And honestly, I think it's working pretty well for him, because the sanctions regime has two giant holes in it, right? One in China and one in Russia. And the strategy of having invested heavily in North Korea's defense industry is currently paying off incredibly for him. It's not just watching. I mean,
the fact that he's reversed decades of models of buying arms from Russia, and now he's selling arms to Russia is quite incredible.
We can watch not only the missiles being shipped out of North Korea, we can watch all the payment in the form of goods coming in to North Korea. So in a stroke, he has given himself a source of hard currency, a source of goods to help the economy, and a close political relationship with one of his two big neighbors. And I think he'll play those two off against one another.
He's very weary of China, right? And has
so
been.
I would be. I mean, I think that's why he had his uncle and half brother murdered. Is he worried that the Chinese would use them to replace him? So he's I'm sorry. I think the guy has played the situation pretty wisely. If I were in his position, I'd be dead.
So are you concerned that beyond currency that he may be getting from Russia, he's also getting weapons technology and primarily in the missile space, maybe even the nuclear space? Is that a concern for you?
Yes. I mean, Putin went out of his way to signal that those kinds of that sort of assistance would be made available, right? They took him to a number of armaments factories. They walked him around the space center. I think that was a really clear signal that while North Korea has indigenized a lot of these capabilities in areas where they are struggling, Russia would certainly consider transferring technology. And so I think—
Do you think that extends even to the nuclear systems?
Well, it's an interesting question whether the North Koreans would want that help. In the sense that I think the North Koreans are going to be a little bit wary about letting foreigners touch the most sensitive things. But certainly for missiles and space launchers, yeah, absolutely. I think combat aircraft is an area where the North Koreans are really woeful. So I think you're going to see a lot of—
The problem is that Russia is going to be challenged in providing it because they have their own needs and their own manufacturing problems.
So this is the Egypt deal. This is how North Korea got a missile program in the first place, which is Egypt had a bunch of Scud missiles that the Soviets would no longer service because Camp David, Egypt had switched sides in the Cold War. And so the Egyptians exported the missiles to North Korea, which reverse engineered them, and then came back and provided services to the Egyptians. So I think, the way I think of it is—
Imagine how we could have stopped that if we had just sold missiles to Egypt, right?
Yes. I no good deed goes unpunished. A consequence of Camp David was we re-kitted the Egyptian army with Western gear, and they were super excited about it. We chose not to give them missiles for, I think, political reasons involving Israel, but also for non-proliferation reasons in general, although I think the Israel argument was probably more important. And the consequence of that was North Korea's missile program and then all of North Korea's missile sales. So Egypt, honestly, Israel would have been better off if we had sold Egypt missiles and skipped the whole—
Because North Korea then helped Iran, of course.
That's right. And Syria.
Yeah.
And Yemen. So that was not— I mean, obviously, life is long and things surprise you. So I don't fault policymakers for not being clairvoyant, but yeah, no good deed goes unpunished. So I think the Russians are probably going to rely on the North Koreans as inexpensive labor. And so if you transfer a capability to the North Koreans and they indigenize it and they produce cheap knockoffs in large quantity, that's an expansion of the Russian defense industrial base.
And a couple of things that struck me as really strange about that argument that he's preparing to go to war. I posted this on X is, if you're preparing for war, would you really ship 1 million or potentially even more shells, artillery shells, to Russia, right? At the time when you would really need it, as we've seen in Ukraine, you can never have enough. So that struck me as strange. And then dismantling the unification ministry, particularly if you've come to the conclusion that this is never happening. This is a big bureaucracy you have to pay for at the time when budgets are constrained. Would you rather spend it on missiles and the nuclear program or a bunch of bureaucrats sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for unification that's never going to come?
Yeah. And again, if you were planning to reunify the peninsula by force, you would need a reunification ministry, right? I mean,
that's true. That's a good point.
You would have to plan for I don't know. We've invaded countries without a plan. So maybe you don't have to, but it's best practices to plan for the day after the war.
That's very, very accurate. One question I have for you, and it's probably impossible to know, but when you see these shipments now of missiles going to Russia, North Korean missiles, and they're starting to use them in significant quantities, one of the challenges that the Russians have had is that their own production can't keep up with the expansion of those missiles in Ukraine. Do you think the North Koreans can, or will they quickly run out of their own inventories too? And obviously they can't ship everything they have to Russia because they need their own deterrent systems.
Yeah, well, one thing we're seeing is a significant expansion of factory space. So over the last couple years leading up to this, we watched North Korea build out all of the factories that they use for munitions production. So we're seeing all kinds of new buildings, new tunneling, like it's just more floor space. So
did that start after the war in Ukraine, or did that precede
No, it started before. There was a kind of a stunning ramp up in investment, where just factories all got bigger. They got new buildings. And so we never really got to the point where we were comfortable with what the throughput was, because it was such a change. And North Korea has walked us through some factories, but what they show us doesn't always make sense. And so it can be very hard to assess. Like,
what do you mean by that?
Well, so the February 11th factory, which is where they make the short-range ballistic missiles Russia's using, they built 2 large new buildings, and about maybe 2 years ago, and when Kim Jong-un went in them, the 2 buildings appeared to have the same purpose. They were for the final assembly of missiles being produced underground.
Not components.
Right. However, the buildings are not the same. So why would you build 2 radically different buildings for the same purpose? So that just doesn't make sense. Like, one has like tool lockers, so that makes sense for final assembly. Like, that's where the workers put their tools. But the other one doesn't have tool lockers in it. So like what? The workers go to the one building, they get their tools, and then they walk across the yard. Like,
it's fascinating.
No, like, they're not, we don't think they're being completely honest with us about their process. And so we have questions about where certain activities are taking place. And so,
well, this is not a question of honesty because they're not letting us in, right? This is a propaganda campaign when he goes in and they photograph it. So it makes sense that part of it is misinformation.
Yes.
There's a misinformation element to it.
And, and it sometimes it's, I don't know, I want to call it innocent misinformation, but sometimes he tore something before it's done. So you walk through and it's empty. And it's not that they cleared it out, it's that they hadn't filled it yet. And it may be that it may be that because of the sales to Russia, maybe they were space constrained and they had to repurpose the facility from one thing to another. We just don't know. But the problem is we never got a good baseline before we saw these sales.
But, obviously it's hard to estimate, but you basically, what I'm hearing from you is you're implying that it's plausible that they can keep up with the rates of missiles that they're shipping to.
Yeah,
to
they're
Russians. Building
just, we had actually identified the factory where they make anti-tank guided missiles, which it was pretty lucky. And they have, increased the size of that by like 4 or 5 times in the last 5 years.
Wow.
So,
one of the big efforts with Russia since they invaded Ukraine was sanctions to try to stop flow of machinery and tools and components to these programs. Obviously, you can't stop it all, but there's the thinking that we at least slowed them down. Do you think that we can have any impact on North Korea? I mean, obviously, we already have very stringent sanctions regimes, but where are they getting the components? Where are they getting the tooling for all of this?
Yeah, I think we can't. I think we did slow them down, and it was probably worth doing. But, like anything you do where you buy time, you have to have a plan. Like, what am I, like, okay, I bought myself 10 years. What do I do with the 10 years? And if the answer is, I spent the 10 years complaining about how awful the North Koreans are, it's like, well, okay, the 10 years is up. One thing we do is we try to assess the equipment we see in the factories. And so, for example, the airframes for those short-range ballistic missiles are metal, and they're made on flow-forming machines. And we observe that North Korea has, over the last 30 years, invested a lot of money in developing a domestic capacity for flow-forming. And all the flow forming machines we see at missile facilities aren't imported. They look domestic to us. And so, I mean, that's not certain, but it doesn't look like a foreign machine. North
That's
Korea
very
doesn't.
different from Russia, where virtually everything is imported from a tooling perspective.
Yes. In fact, there's just a case where I think 2 German companies were accused of selling maybe CNC machine tools to an intermediary, I think in Turkey. I could have the details wrong.
We've published a lot of this on this in Silverado, that there's machines coming from South Korea, from Taiwan, from Germany. Absolutely. The Russians are buying a lot of that.
A lot of those machines are available used. There's a whole secondary market. And part of the problem is missiles are not new. I think we have this idea of them as being high tech, but a missile from the 1970s, which is not terribly high tech, will still kill you dead. And so a lot of the machines we see in North Korea are kind of the ones that are imported, at least, were imported 20, 25 years ago. And as long as they could service them, they're great.
All right, last question, Jeffrey. We seem to be entering a new age in nuclear nonproliferation, right? We've been able to keep this genie mostly in the bottle since the signing of the Nonproliferation Treaty back in the early 70s. And yes, we had India and Pakistan that developed nuclear weapons during that time, and South Africa that did, and then later dismantled them. But now things seem to be changing really everywhere, right? Both in North Korea, not just becoming a nuclear state, but building significant capability. Iran on a threshold that they could literally step over at any moment. The buildup in China, Russia making noise about potentially resuming testing. Even in the U.S., you've posted on social that there's a lot of activity happening at our test sites, even though claim we don't want to test first. So where do you see the next 20, 30 years here? Are we entering a really, really dangerous period here where you're going to see even more proliferation?
Yes, I think this is one of those transitional periods. I'm not a pessimist in the sense that sometimes the transitions work out okay and sometimes they don't. And I mean, you pay your money and take your chances. But things are really different. I don't think we have quite embraced the degree of change that we're looking at. I will say, in the defense of the Nevada National Security Site, they're very transparent about what they're doing.
And, I think you came out and actually saw it recently, right? Or a team.
Yeah. They brought a bunch of us on a visit and showed us all the things that were going on. And I would love for Russia and China to do the same. My sense though is that we're generally not sort of looking squarely at how quickly things are changing. And that's eventually we're gonna realize that we're probably gonna overreact. I mean, that's what we always do, right? We're like too slow, and then it's like too much. But yeah, the reality is that the technology to build nuclear weapons and missiles is so much easier to get, right? There is this lowering of the barrier to entry. And so our tools are changing, and our tools are increasingly less like, I'm going to not let you have it. And they're more like, well, here's what I could do for you instead. And that's a different approach. And I think, we've already seen it on the missile side. It's pretty much failed on the missile side. We have a missile.
We have Houthis launching missiles and shutting down trade in Red Sea, right? It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean the prospects of stopping missile proliferation are, I would argue, over. Now there might be some high end capabilities we can restrict, and that's worth doing. But again, we're buying time, and what are you going to do with the time? And so I think that should be a warning, right? If North Korea can do it, right? If North Korea can build nuclear weapons and become a major weapons supplier to Russia, I mean, there aren't a lot of countries in the world that are poorer than North Korea. So yeah, it's a really different era. And I think we just have not squarely looked in the face. This is going to be scary.
So there's this undercurrent of debate that always happens when we're talking about North Korea and even China, Taiwan. And the simplistic argument is always, well, we should just let South Korea get nuclear weapons, or Japan, or Taiwan,
Yeah.
which would be, clearly a red line for China and a impetus for them to invade before that capability gets deployed. And, my argument has always been more proliferation is not good, even if it's amongst allies, because even allies you don't control, and that makes the world more dangerous. But do you think we should be starting to rethink that? And
I don't. And the reason I don't is I think you see a neat illustration in this in the form of Israel. Israel has nuclear weapons, and Israel does not want Iran to get them. And I get that. I understand that emotionally, viscerally, like I get it. But that also means you don't believe in deterrence. If Israel has nuclear weapons and it still regards Iran getting them as a threat, that means that it does not believe its nuclear weapons will offset that threat.
Well, hold on a second. There's a more nuanced argument in that they could believe that Iran would not launch nuclear weapons, but the argument could be that they would have a freer hand.
That's exactly
in the region, right?
But I mean, that is exactly my point to the South Koreans, which is a nuclear-armed North Korea has a freer hand to be aggressive in the way they were in 2010. South Korea getting nuclear weapons doesn't end up deterring that, right? And so that's the reason I don't favor allied proliferation is the core deterrence mission. I think you can extend that deterrence from the U.S. And, I'm sympathetic to the French argument that they think that their deterrence a little better because it's their own. But
there is a credibility issue of are you willing to compromise Washington for Seoul or Tokyo or whatever?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I understand the French argument that, they're not willing to take that chance. The Germans were. And I tend to think that on balance, the German solution is a little better because more nuclear weapons in the world and more nuclear power is just
at least better for the world. May not be better for Germany, right?
Yeah. Although, the ambient, I actually think that ambient risk probably does compound. It's great if you're like one of like 2 or 3, but if you're one of like 30 or 40, it may not be so great, right? So I don't think national nuclear programs are that much better than extended deterrence. I think it might be a little better. And it goes back to pretty much everything I've said, which is it's really hard to properly price this stuff. And so so instead of extended deterrence, you get your own deterrent. So you that's like whatever, maybe 10% better, but now the world is like 50% more dangerous.
We also forget, everyone kind of talks about Cuban Missile Crisis as if that was the only time when we came close to nuclear conflict. Obviously, East Berlin was even worse, West Berlin crisis a year earlier. But, during the Korean War, there were real debates in the Truman administration about whether to use nuclear weapons, right?
Yes.
And,
Eisenhower decided he would if armistice negotiations broke down. I don't know if he'd have gone through with it, but, on paper, they decided they would.
Yeah, so that's sort of the quote-unquote rational Americans in the early stages of having nuclear weapons. Would we feel comfortable with an ally that just got them, that they would be very rational and would say, no, we will never use them first? It gets really dangerous, right?
And sometimes your friends stop being your friends. We still have nuclear weapons sitting in Turkey, and our relationship with Turkey is, the Facebook relationship status is, it's complicated, right? So
look at Iran, right? The Shah was building a nuclear program. We were helping him in the early stages of that. So
Israel attempted to sell missiles to the Shah in the late 1970s. You literally could have had a situation where Israeli missiles would have shown up in crates, and then the Shah would have been overthrown, and the Iranians would have turned around and, pointed those right back. So I'm not unsympathetic to the French argument that they're better off with their own. But I think when I look at alliance management and global security broadly, I think we are all better off at a lower number of nuclear powers, particularly if the U.S. can credibly extend deterrence, which, we have to do. And, that requires some policy choices.
Jeffrey, it is always so uplifting to talk to you every single time on these issues.
We'll probably get a muddle through.
Yes. And you have a terrific podcast on that, the reason we're still here. And hopefully that reason will remain for many, many centuries. millennia, perhaps, and Arms Control Wonk, another great podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. Always a pleasure.
It was great to talk to you.
Oh, no.